This week again we come to kind of a working out of biblical theology in chapter 4. And so last week he kind of looked at the Old Testament, how biblical theology works out in the Old Testament. This week he brings in the New Testament. How does biblical theology work out in the New Testament? So these are long chapters. They're not just as full of content as the earlier ones are, but what they're doing is they're teaching us how to work it out. That's part of discipleship. Every week of discipleship is going to look different. Maybe you've been in Bible studies where every week you're just filled up, you feel joyful, and it feels wonderful. But this might be a little bit different take. And what we're doing is we're giving you tools to live out your Christian life. And though they might not be as fun at times, I think they're going to be useful and helpful as you continue to walk on and as you continue to grow in your walk with Jesus and then lead your kids and lead groups and everything. We need these tools to kind of help us out. So stick with it, hang in there. Let me just point out a couple things. This week again, I want you to focus on the preaching and teaching tips in the chapter. Those little boxes are going to be helpful to basically break down what they're teaching and show you how to work it out. Brief little discussions on there. And so in your small groups, talk about those. Work through those preaching and teaching tips. That first one there that we come to on 59 is helpful. He says that the Gospels are all about Jesus. Of course they are, and we know that. And yet it's easy to lose sight of Him and focus on our sermon illustrations on something that's not really of primary importance. Right? And so maybe we've heard pastors preach through different sections of the Gospels, then miss the primary importance of Jesus and try to make it a moralistic teaching or something. So we need to focus in on who these Gospels are talking about. And he says, for example, if you were teaching through the Gospel according to Matthew and you arrive in 8:23 through 9:8, how would you handle this passage? There are three descriptions of Jesus performing a variety of miracles, and there are many possible rabbit trails because the three events recorded in this section of Scripture are so breathtakingly amazing. The calming of the storm, the healing of the demon-possessed man, and the healing and forgiving of the crippled sinner. What's the point? Jesus is the one who has authority. He has authority over creation, over demons, over sin, and sickness. Make sure when preaching or teaching from the Gospels that you are making much more of Jesus than anything else. And so what these parables and stories are teaching us is Jesus has authority. He's the king. He's the one in Genesis 1:1 who created all things. He's the one who, all through Genesis 1 and chapter 2, is the creator of the universe. And so here is this one who is the creator living amongst us, casting out demons, healing the lame, causing the blind to see, and the dead to be raised to life, and He's feeding the 5,000. He's doing all these things. He's calming storms. He's God. He's Lord over creation, over the body, and all these things. So focus in on those. Look at those preaching and teaching tips. I want to focus in on one in particular on page 70. So on page 70, it's a long preaching and teaching tip, but what he does is he focuses on this idea of the indicative and the imperative. It sounds like big words and they're confusing, but read through that section and hang out in that section for a little bit. The indicative and the imperative is so important as we read a lot of the epistles and the whole Bible, but the epistles really work these things out. And as we're in 1 Peter in our sermon series on Sunday morning, Peter hits on these regularly. And so I'll be preaching this coming Sunday. So when you watch this, it'll be last Sunday. And so I'm going to bring up some of these imperatives and indicatives in it. And basically what it is, an example, Peter commands his readers to be holy in all your conduct. That's the imperative, be holy in all your conduct. But notice how Peter grounds his imperative to holiness in the glorious indicatives of God's saving call and His holiness. As obedient children, he says, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as you who called you as holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. So be holy because I'm holy. And so work through that section on page 70. Again, they're showing you how to work out biblical theology in the New Testament through a New Testament lens. And so look at that, hang out there, ask questions, work that in your small groups. But this week we're going to be looking on Genesis chapter 10 and 11. Here we see another genealogy taking place in Genesis chapter 10 as well as 11. We've already seen this taking place in Genesis chapter 5, Genesis chapter 9. And so here we see another genealogy. Genealogies are important. Remember, this seed of the woman is coming. And so we're tracing this line of these genealogies. And so we also see in this section the Tower of Babel. And what's interesting is the Tower of Babel story is strategically placed in between two genealogies. And so as you're reading your chapters this week, look at how the author put the Tower of Babel and where he put it at between two genealogies. Both of these genealogies come from Shem. And so we've already seen Shem in the previous chapters, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. And so here we see this line of Shem. And what's interesting, the name Shem in Hebrew is also the same name for name, the same word for name. So Shem and Shem could mean the name Shem or the word name. And so the author is going to be playing on this Hebrew word for name as he works through there. And we'll see that here shortly as we look at that. But the Hebrew word for shame and name is, again, it's the same one, and it's used over and over. Let me just go and hit while I'm talking about that. In Genesis 11:4, they say that let us go make a name for ourselves. Shame. Let us go make a name for ourselves. In 12:2, they said with Abraham, he's going to bless it and make a great name through Abraham. And so we have one line going to Babylon, another line from Shem going to the house of Abraham. And so we see these two lines breaking off. And so you'll see there in 10:22, you see Shem. In 10:24, you see Eber. And then in 10:26 to 29, you see Joktan. And so there's this line. The first line is Shem, Eber, and Joktan. The second line we see in chapter 11 is Shem, Eber, and Peleg. And so it's through Peleg that the sons of Abraham come. And so we see these two different lines going two different ways, one to Babylon and another to the house of Abraham. And so it seems that the author has strategically placed this Babylon narrative in between these two genealogies for a purpose. And so Genesis chapter 11, we read this: Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as the people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And so a couple things happening already. We see that the whole earth had one language. What's interesting, in Genesis chapter 10, just the previous chapter, in verse 5, all these people had their own languages. In verse 20, they had their own languages. In verse 31, they had their own languages. So the question is, did all these come together and form the same language, or is this Babylon narrative, the Tower of Babel, really happened before Genesis chapter 10, and then a result of this is the same as different languages? It's probably what's happening. We already saw this take place. Hebrew authors don't always put things in chronological order. And so we see in the first two chapters of Genesis, we see this happening. We see a creation account and a creation account. Speaking the same thing, but from a different zooming in on. And so we see it's not necessarily in order, but he's trying to do something with it. So Babylon narrative probably happened before 10, because we see that all the people there had the same language and same words, 11:1. But in chapter 10, verses 5, 20, and 31, we see they all had different languages. And so it looks like he's moving the story to make it help us to understand this genealogy and this lineage. But what do? They come from the east. We've already saw this over and over and over, hadn't we? So Genesis chapter 3:24, when they're kicked out of the garden, what happens? In 3:24, he drove the man out of the garden. And at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed a cherubim and a flaming sword, and it turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. So at the east side of the garden, this took place. In 4:16, then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So we see this east. Later on, we'll see in Genesis 13:11, whenever Lot goes away from Abraham. Genesis 13:11. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. And so he journeys east, and then we have this Sodom and Gomorrah stuff in the east later on. Genesis chapter 25, verse 6, whenever Abraham has sons from his concubine, he sends them out away from him because they're going out away because Isaac's the chosen one. So in 25:6, with the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. One more we're going to look at in Jacob. Jacob 29, the deceitful Jacob 29 verse 1. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. And so we see this eastward thing. And so the author's trying to do something. He's pulling us in. He's wanting to say something about this city of Babylon and the eastward direction of it. And so what do here? They come together, and we read that they migrated from the east. They found the plain of Shinar, verse 3. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Verse 4, then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with a top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the world." So they're there to make a name for themselves, lest they get dispersed over the whole earth. What's God already told them to do? God already gave the creation mandate in 128 to be fruitful and multiply. In 9:7, he does the same thing to Noah. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth with your presence. And so here in the Tower of Babel story, they're coming together into one place to make a name for themselves, lest they get dispersed across the whole earth. And so they're directly disobeying God's command. And so they come together, and they build this city and they build this tower. So what's going on with this tower? What's going on with this city? There's a lot of discussion on it. Some say, this tower looks like it might be a way to get to the gods, and so its top is in the heavens, and so maybe it's like a temple or a ziggurat or something like that, and so it looks like they're trying to return to the gods or something, and there might be this idolatry taking place and this worship of false gods and stuff going on. Maybe that's one of them. Others say, the ziggurats wasn't even invented yet in history, and so it might not have been that, but it might have been a fortified city or a big fortress for protection. And so, there's a debate going on back and forth. It looks like there's something going on with it because God comes down and disperses them out. So there probably is some kind of idol worship going on there, if we know what's going on with fallen humanity. And so they come together to make a name for themselves. But, verse 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language." Again, chapter 10, we see they all have different languages. Here they have one language, so it's probably prior to 10. And this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. "Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all of the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. And so the Lord comes down, disperses them out, and gives them different languages, and so they go out throughout the earth. And so that's kind of the story you've heard about. Probably ever since you was growing up in church, if you grew up in the church, is this story of the Tower of Babel and this being dispersed out. But in 11:9, we see that they call the name Babel because there the Lord confused the languages of all the earth. What happens in Acts chapter 2? If you have your Bibles, flip over to Acts chapter 2. Here we see a confusion of all the languages, but in Acts chapter 2, we see the Lord bridging the gap of the language barrier. Acts chapter 2, verse 1. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place, and suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to each and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Verse 5, Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each was hearing them speaking in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia and Judea and Cappadocia and Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretians and Arabians. We all hear them telling in their own language, in their own tongues, the mighty works of God. And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, what does this mean? And so here we see God bridging the gap of the languages and the pouring out of the Holy Spirit on His early church. And then we see this beautiful sight in Revelation chapter 5. Revelation chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. We read this, and they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom of priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth forever. And so in heaven, we're going to see this beautiful representation of all people, languages, and nations and tribes together worshiping this one true God. And so after the Tower of Babel story, we see this line from Shem to Peleg, which leads us straight to Abraham and the story of Abraham, father Abraham. And so we see that story. And what this does, we see this genealogy in 10 through 32, which makes this, and then we also see this this other genealogy through the end of it there at 32, which makes this distinct break in Genesis. So if you're looking at commentaries or series and stuff in Genesis, most people put Genesis 1 through 11 together, the primeval history, and then they put 12 through 50 together, which is the patriarchal history. And so now we're coming to this break in Genesis, and we're going into the history of the patriarchs. So hope that is helpful this week. Look forward to hearing feedback as you are getting together in your small groups and discussing this week. God bless you. Have a great week.